5000 BC was the century that invented civilization, and what happened during these 100 years is absolutely insane. The 50th century BC. 10 mind-blowing facts about the century that invented civilization. While your ancestors were supposedly living in caves and grunting at each other, they were actually building the first cities, creating the first governments, inventing agriculture that still feeds us today, and laying the foundations for literally everything we call human civilization. Ready to have everything you thought you knew about the Stone Age completely destroyed. The year 5000 BC kicked off what might be the most important century in human history, and almost nobody knows about it. This wasn't the primitive Stone Age that movies show you. This was when humans figured out how to stop being nomadic hunters and become the masters of the planet. But here's where things get really mind-blowing. Everything we think we know about early human civilization is completely backwards. The people living in 5000 BC weren't struggling to survive. They were so successful at survival that they had time to invent cities, governments, religion, and trade networks that connected continents. This wasn't the dawn of civilization. This was civilization hitting its stride. Fact number 1. Humans accidentally invented cities while trying to store grain. The world's first cities weren't planned. They happened because people needed somewhere to store their grain harvest, and accidentally created urban civilization in the process. Around 5000 BC, agricultural communities in Mesopotamia were producing so much surplus grain that they needed permanent storage facilities, security to protect them, and administrators to manage distribution. What started as simple granaries became the foundation of urban life. People settled permanently around these storage centers because that's where the food was. Craftsmen set up workshops nearby because that's where the customers were. Traders established routes between storage centers because that's where the wealth was concentrated. The psychological shift was enormous. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had been nomadic. When resources ran out, you moved somewhere else. Suddenly, people were staying in one place year after year, generation after generation. This wasn't just a change in lifestyle. It was a complete transformation of human consciousness. These early urban centers required entirely new forms of social organization. Someone had to decide how much grain each family could take. Someone had to organize defense against raiders who wanted to steal stored food. Someone had to coordinate trade with other communities. Urban life created the need for government, law, and social hierarchy. The most mind-blowing part: these first cities were more successful than anyone expected. Urban populations grew faster than rural populations because cities could support more people per square mile. Urban communities became wealthier than rural communities because specialization made everyone more productive. The urban revolution wasn't just changing how people lived. It was proving that city life was superior to nomadic life. Fact number 2. The Mesopotamians invented government by accident. Mesopotamian communities around 5000 BC didn't set out to create the first governments. They just needed someone to settle disputes about water rights, and accidentally invented political authority in the process. The irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible required unprecedented levels of cooperation between communities. River water had to be diverted through channels that crossed multiple settlements. Maintenance of these systems required coordinated labor from thousands of people. Most critically, water allocation had to be managed fairly, or communities would go to war over access to irrigation. Someone had to have the authority to make decisions that everyone would accept. The solution was brilliant and completely new. Communities agreed to accept the authority of individuals who could coordinate irrigation projects and settle water disputes. These early administrators weren't chosen for their military strength or family connections. They were selected for their ability to organize complex projects and make decisions that kept communities functioning. This created the first bureaucratic systems in human history. Water management required record-keeping, planning, and coordination that couldn't be handled by informal social arrangements. Mesopotamian administrators developed writing systems to track water allocation, created laws to govern irrigation disputes, and established procedures for large-scale project management. The psychological impact was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, people were accepting the authority of individuals who weren't their relatives or tribal leaders. Political legitimacy was based on competence rather than kinship, creating the foundation for all future governmental systems. Fact number 3. Women invented agriculture and accidentally created gender inequality. The agricultural revolution that transformed human civilization was primarily developed by women, but its success accidentally created the first systematic gender inequality in human history. Archaeological evidence from 5000 BC shows that women were the primary innovators in plant cultivation, seed selection, and crop management. Female gatherers had developed extensive knowledge of plant biology through thousands of years of collecting wild foods. Women understood which plants were edible, when they ripened, how to process them, and where they grew best. When communities began experimenting with cultivation, women naturally became the experts in agricultural techniques. Early agricultural societies were surprisingly egalitarian. Women controlled food production, men handled hunting and defense, and both roles were considered equally important. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of relative gender equality in burial practices, tool distribution, and settlement patterns. But agricultural success created wealth accumulation that gradually shifted power toward men. As communities produced surplus food, warfare became more common as groups competed for fertile land. Military leadership became increasingly important, and military activities were predominantly male. Gradually, male military leaders began accumulating political authority that extended beyond warfare. The ownership of land became crucial as agriculture made territory valuable in ways that hunting and gathering societies had never experienced. In most early agricultural societies, land ownership was controlled by males, creating economic inequality that reinforced military hierarchy. Women's agricultural expertise remained crucial, but their social status began declining as wealth and power became concentrated among male landowners. Fact number 4. The Sumerians accidentally invented writing while trying to track beer. The world's first writing system wasn't created for literature, law, or religion. It was invented by Sumerian accountants who needed to keep track of beer production and couldn't remember all the numbers. Around 5000 BC, Sumerian communities were producing so much beer that administrators needed a way to record production, distribution, and consumption. Beer wasn't just a beverage in Sumerian society. It was a form of currency, a religious offering, and a dietary staple that was safer to drink than water. Managing beer production required tracking grain allocation, worker payments, and product distribution across multiple communities. The accounting systems needed to handle these calculations were too complex for human memory. Sumerian scribes developed symbolic representations for numbers, quantities, and products that could be pressed into clay tablets. These symbols initially represented concrete objects. A jar symbol meant beer. A sheaf symbol meant grain. Numerical symbols indicated quantities, but the system quickly evolved beyond simple accounting. The psychological breakthrough was enormous. Humans had discovered that abstract symbols could represent concrete reality, allowing information to be stored and transmitted without face-to-face communication. Ideas could be preserved across time and space in ways that had never been possible before. Writing systems spread rapidly because they provided massive advantages for administration, trade, and cultural transmission. Communities with writing could coordinate more complex projects, maintain more extensive trade networks, and preserve more accurate historical records. Written communication wasn't just convenient, it was revolutionary. Fact number 5. Climate change forced humans to invent civilization. The agricultural revolution that created human civilization wasn't a choice. It was a desperate response to climate change that made traditional hunting and gathering impossible. Around 5000 BC, global climate patterns were shifting in ways that disrupted the environmental conditions that had supported nomadic lifestyles for millennia. The end of the last ice age had created a period of unusual climate stability that allowed human populations to grow larger than ever before. But that stability was ending. Temperature fluctuations, changing precipitation patterns, and shifting vegetation zones were making traditional foraging strategies unreliable. Larger human populations couldn't survive using traditional nomadic methods because there weren't enough wild resources to support them. Communities that had grown accustomed to abundant wild foods suddenly faced potential starvation as environmental conditions changed. The choice wasn't between nomadic and agricultural lifestyles. It was between agriculture and extinction. Agricultural communities developed because they could support larger populations on smaller amounts of land. Cultivation could produce more calories per acre than foraging, and stored grain could provide security against environmental uncertainty. Agriculture wasn't a luxury that successful communities chose. It was a survival strategy that desperate communities adopted. The psychological impact was profound. Humans had been forced to take control of their environment in ways that no previous generation had ever attempted. Instead of adapting to natural conditions, humans were adapting natural conditions to serve human needs. This wasn't just a technological change. It was a fundamental shift in the human relationship with nature. Fact number 6. Trade networks connected the ancient world before anyone realized it. By 5000 BC, trade networks were connecting communities across thousands of miles, creating the first global economy, while most people had no idea they were participating in international commerce. Archaeological evidence shows that goods were traveling between Europe, Asia, and Africa through complex exchange systems that nobody was consciously managing. Obsidian tools found in European settlements came from volcanic sources in Turkey. Copper artifacts discovered in Mesopotamian sites originated from mines in the Balkans. Shell ornaments worn by Central Asian communities were harvested from Indian Ocean coastlines. These weren't isolated exchanges. They were systematic trade relationships that connected continents. The logistics were mind-blowing. Goods were passing through dozens of intermediaries over distances that would challenge modern transportation systems. Each community along trade routes added value by processing materials, providing transportation, or offering local market access. Nobody understood the full extent of these networks, because no individual trader traveled the entire route. Trade relationships were creating cultural exchanges that were transforming human civilization. Technological innovations developed in one region were spreading to distant communities within generations. Artistic styles, religious ideas, and social practices were being transmitted across continents through commercial contacts. Most importantly, trade networks were creating economic interdependence that made warfare less attractive and cooperation more profitable. Communities that might have fought over local resources discovered that peaceful trade could provide access to materials that military conquest couldn't achieve. Commerce was becoming more powerful than conflict. Fact number 7. The Egyptians discovered that deserts could be made fertile. Egyptian communities around 5000 BC accomplished something that seemed impossible. They transformed desert regions into agricultural paradise through irrigation techniques that were so advanced they're still being used today. The Nile Valley wasn't naturally fertile. It was created by human engineering that controlled river flooding with unprecedented precision. Egyptian hydraulic engineers developed irrigation systems that could capture Nile flood waters, distribute them across vast agricultural areas, and store them for use during dry seasons. This required massive construction projects, sophisticated planning, and coordination between communities that had never been achieved before. The engineering was revolutionary. Egyptian irrigation systems used gravity-fed channels, water storage basins, and flood control structures that could manage water flow across hundreds of miles of river valley. These systems were so efficient that they could support population densities that wouldn't be matched anywhere else for thousands of years. Agricultural productivity in irrigated Egyptian lands was so high that communities could support large populations of non-agricultural specialists. Egyptian society developed the first professional classes: scribes, craftsmen, engineers, and administrators who didn't have to produce their own food because agricultural surplus could feed them. The psychological impact was enormous. Egyptians had proven that human engineering could improve on natural conditions, creating environments that were more productive than anything nature provided. This wasn't just irrigation. It was the first systematic attempt to redesign natural landscapes for human benefit. Fact number 8. Humans figured out how to domesticate animals without understanding biology. Around 5000 BC, human communities were successfully domesticating animals through selective breeding techniques that produced dramatic genetic changes, despite having no understanding of inheritance, genetics, or animal biology. The speed and effectiveness of early animal domestication was so remarkable that it rivals modern genetic engineering. Early herders noticed that some animals were more docile, productive, or useful than others, and began breeding selectively for desirable traits. Within a few generations, domestic animals were developing characteristics that were completely different from their wild ancestors. Domestic sheep produced more wool, domestic cattle gave more milk, and domestic pigs grew larger and more docile. The psychological breakthrough was enormous. Humans had discovered that they could reshape living creatures to serve human needs through careful breeding selection. This wasn't just animal husbandry. It was the first systematic attempt to control biological evolution. Domesticated animals provided more than just food and materials. They revolutionized human transportation, agriculture, and military capability. Horses and donkeys made long-distance travel possible. Oxen made large-scale agriculture practical. Sheep and goats provided renewable sources of fiber and protein that could support larger populations. Most remarkably, animal domestication created the first truly symbiotic relationships between humans and other species. Domestic animals were better fed, better protected, and more successful reproductively than their wild cousins. Human communities provided security and resources that wild animals couldn't access independently. Fact number 9. Religion was invented to solve economic problems. The first organized religions around 5000 BC weren't created to answer spiritual questions. They were developed to solve practical problems of resource allocation, social coordination, and economic management that early communities couldn't handle through secular authority alone. Agricultural communities needed ways to coordinate labor for massive projects like irrigation systems, grain storage, and settlement construction. Religious rituals provided mechanisms for organizing collective action that couldn't be achieved through individual decision-making. Religious festivals became opportunities for community-wide planning and resource allocation. Religious authority was particularly effective for managing economic inequality. As agricultural communities developed surplus wealth, economic differences between families created social tensions that threatened community stability. Religious leaders could legitimize wealth distribution in ways that secular authorities couldn't achieve. Temple systems became the first banks, storing community wealth and managing its distribution according to religious principles. Religious institutions could accumulate resources across generations, funding long-term projects that no individual could afford. Temple granaries provided security against crop failures that could destroy entire communities. The psychological impact was revolutionary. Religious belief systems provided shared values that could unite communities despite economic differences and social tensions. Religious rituals created emotional bonds that strengthened social cooperation beyond what rational calculation could achieve. Fact number 10. The invention of pottery. Accidentally created art. Around 5000 BC, humans invented pottery to solve practical problems of food storage and cooking, but accidentally created the first artistic tradition that would influence human culture for millennia. Pottery began as purely functional technology, but rapidly evolved into sophisticated artistic expression. Early potters quickly discovered that clay could be shaped into forms that were both functional and beautiful. Decorative techniques developed as potters experimented with surface treatments, color applications, and sculptural elements. What started as utilitarian craft became the foundation of visual art. Pottery provided the first medium for artistic expression that could be preserved permanently and reproduced systematically. Unlike earlier art forms that were temporary or unique, pottery could be created in series, traded between communities, and preserved for future generations. Artistic styles could spread across continents through pottery trade. The psychological breakthrough was enormous. Humans had discovered that practical objects could be made beautiful without sacrificing functionality. This wasn't just decoration. It was the first systematic attempt to combine utility with aesthetic pleasure. Pottery styles became markers of cultural identity that helped communities maintain social cohesion while participating in long-distance trade networks. Distinctive pottery designs identified community membership, social status, and cultural affiliations in ways that could be recognized across vast distances. But here's where 5000 BC gets absolutely mind-bending. All of these revolutionary developments, cities, governments, agriculture, writing, trade networks, irrigation, domestication, religion, and art, weren't separate innovations happening independently. They were all connected parts of a single transformation that was turning humans from another animal species into the masters of the planet. Each innovation created conditions that made other innovations necessary. Cities required governments to function. Governments required writing to operate. Writing enabled trade networks to expand. Trade networks made irrigation projects profitable. Irrigation supported larger populations that needed more complex social organization. Every breakthrough created new problems that required additional breakthroughs to solve. The century from 5000 to 4900 BC wasn't just witnessing the birth of civilization, it was witnessing the transformation of human consciousness itself. People were learning to think in completely new ways about time, space, social relationships, and their place in the natural world. The most mind-blowing aspect of 5000 BC is that it revealed something unique about human beings. We're the only species that can consciously redesign our own living conditions. While every other animal species adapts to environmental conditions, humans began adapting environmental conditions to serve human purposes. This wasn't just technological progress. It was a fundamental shift in what it means to be human. The people living in 5000 BC were the first humans who could imagine a future different from the past, and then actually create that future through systematic effort. The foundations of everything we call civilization, cities, governments, agriculture, writing, trade, religion, and art, were all established by people who had no idea they were creating the modern world. They were just solving immediate problems, but their solutions accidentally created the template for all future human development. And that's how 5000 BC accidentally invented civilization while trying to solve simple problems like storing grain and tracking beer production. Every major aspect of human society, from governments to global trade networks, can be traced back to innovations that Stone Age people developed as practical solutions to everyday challenges. If this video completely changed how you think about ancient history, smash that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the centuries that created our world. Drop a comment below and let me know which of these facts blew your mind the most. And if you're ready to see how these innovations developed over the next century, check out our video on 4900 to 4800 BC, where things get even more incredible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one as we continue our journey through the centuries that built human civilization.